right, well, Atlanta native and singer Ciara, she has stepped her way on over to Africa, becoming one of the first public figures to gain citizenship in Benin. Well, the small West African country recently passed a law granting citizenship to descendants of enslaved people.
It's not just a passport, it's a prophecy fulfilled. When Ciara held up her new Beninese citizenship before flashing cameras, it wasn't Hollywood. It was history coming full circle. The land that once shipped her ancestors in chains has now called her back by name. This isn't charity, it's Africa reclaiming its own blood. For the West, it's unsettling. For Africans and their descendants, it's electrifying. Because this moment isn't about one celebrity, it's about the start of something bigger, something terrifying to those who built empires on exile. And that's the question echoing across two continents tonight. Has the age of the stolen finally become the age of the returned? Let's find out. You could almost hear the ancestors exhale. When Ciara raised that Beninese passport to the cameras, the air shifted. The same Atlantic Ocean that once swallowed her ancestors' screams now carried their daughter home, not in chains, but in power. And for the first time in living memory, the world had to watch a black woman from America cross that invisible line between diaspora and return. The West called it a gesture. Africa called it justice. Because this wasn't about paperwork. This was about ghosts finally getting a seat at the table of the living. Benin, the land once branded as a launch pad for human cargo, just flipped the script. The door of no return, that haunting monument on Ouida's coast, was never meant to open again. But here it was, unlatched, glowing, alive. The same soil that had watched its children vanish into the ocean was now watching them walk back through the gate, heads high, carrying microphones instead of shackles. The West doesn't know how to process that. It has never seen Africa give, only beg. And yet here was Benin, not asking for aid, not chasing validation, not playing polite. Instead, it looked at the descendants of the stolen and said, "You've always been ours. Let's finish what history interrupted." The scene was surreal. A modern artist wrapped in African fabric standing on the same land her ancestors were torn from, reclaiming identity through a law written in the language of redemption. For the diaspora watching from New York, Atlanta, Kingston, and London, this was no concert. It was a question. What happens when home calls your name, but you've built your whole life pretending you never needed it? When the continent says, "Come back," do you have the courage to look it in the eye? Because that's what this moment was. Not a celebrity milestone, but a dare. Benin didn't just open its borders, it opened its memory. And memory is dangerous. It reminds people of what was stolen and what can still be reclaimed. The applause has faded, but the shock hasn't. Because this isn't just a headline about Ciara. This is Africa, finally speaking in the language of power. Welcome home. And if the past has finally found its voice, then we have to ask, what about those still wandering? Those disconnected children scattered across continents, still searching for home in foreign tongues? You can't understand why Ciara's return shook the world until you understand the weight of those who never got to return. The children of the African diaspora aren't just living across oceans, they're living inside a fracture. Their ancestors were ripped from maps, languages, and gods so completely that entire bloodlines forgot the direction of home. That's not just geography, that's spiritual amnesia. For centuries, the descendants of the enslaved have lived in borrowed identities. They learned to carry surnames that once belonged to slave owners, to worship gods who looked nothing like them, to pledge allegiance to flags that once sold their bodies. Generations grew up chasing inclusion inside the same systems that had erased them. They were told that survival meant assimilation, that to make it, you had to forget what was stolen from you. But forgetting came at a cost. It created a kind of cultural insomnia, a restless soul that could never fully sleep because something deep inside kept whispering, "You don't belong here." That whisper is what makes moments like Ciara's citizenship feel seismic. It's not about a passport, it's about closure, about an entire people realizing that the line between them and home was drawn by someone else's greed. Every black child born in the West inherits that contradiction. You're told your ancestors were kings and queens, but you grow up in neighborhoods designed to break you. You're told Africa is yours, but when you look for it in school books, you find famine and war. You're told to be proud of your roots, yet punished for having them. The diaspora has been living in a cultural split screen, glorified and vilified at the same time. And yet, somehow, the memory never died. It hid in rhythm, in the drum beats that survived the slave ships, in the way African Americans clap on the offbeat, the way Caribbean people season food like it's sacred, the way Brazilians dance like every movement is defiance. Culture became the only passport they had left. Every melody, every ritual, every hairstyle carried encrypted coordinates, fragments of home disguised as survival. That's why when one of their own returns, not as a visitor, but as a citizen, the symbolism hits like thunder. It's not just one person coming back, it's millions of spirits getting a sliver of redemption. The continent that was painted as lost is now the compass. The children who were taught to forget are beginning to remember. But memory is dangerous when it starts to organize, because once people remember where they come from, they start questioning who benefited from their forgetting. And that's where this story begins to sting, because the diaspora's amnesia wasn't accidental. It was manufactured, monetized, and maintained. So the question now is not, why are they returning? It's why they were made to leave in the first place. From the 17th to the 19th century, Dahome's ports, especially Ouida, became the arteries through which bodies flowed westward. Each departure was a ritual of erasure, names stripped, gods banned, language drowned. The Atlantic was not an ocean then. It was a graveyard with tides. The West called it commerce. Africa remembers it as a loss, measured in tonnage. Benin's modern leaders know this history isn't abstract. It's alive in their architecture, in their silence, in the unspoken shame of towns that once grew rich on human trade. That's why this new citizenship law isn't a branding exercise. It's an act of national repentance. By opening its borders to descendants of the enslaved, Benin isn't selling redemption, it's buying back dignity. But make no mistake, this move is also strategic. It rewrites a moral narrative that Europe never allowed Africa to control. For centuries, the West owned the version of history that said Africans were complicit in their own enslavement, reducing the entire continent to caricature, savage kings trading their own kind. But the truth is more complex. Dahomey, like many African kingdoms, was cornered by imperial economics. European traders didn't arrive as partners, they arrived as predators with guns, gold, and God. Resistance meant annihilation. Collaboration meant survival. It was a trap engineered by colonial capitalism, where every choice led to loss. Now, centuries later, the descendants of those taken return not to punish Benin, but to rewire that history, to stand on the same beaches where their ancestors were branded and say, "We're still here." That's why the ceremony granting diaspora citizenship happens near the door of no return. That arch, carved with figures of chained Africans walking toward ships, was built as a memorial, but Benin's new law gives it purpose. The door is no longer a one-way corridor of disappearance. It's a revolving gate of revival. And this transformation is not just emotional, it's legal, political, and spiritual. It declares that Africa will no longer let Europe define who is African enough. It reclaims the right to decide who belongs. In that sense, Benin isn't just fixing its past, it's weaponizing it. But redemption always carries risk. Once you open a door that was sealed for 400 years, you invite not only the lost children, but also the ghosts. The same ghosts that whisper, "We remember who sold us. We remember who bought us." So the next question becomes, can a nation seeking forgiveness also face its own guilt? Can the homeland truly heal if it doesn't confess how it became the marketplace of its own people? Every act of return demands a reckoning. The moment Benin opened that long sealed door, it also opened a conversation the continent has avoided for generations, our own complicity. The slave trade didn't happen in a vacuum. It wasn't a faceless European machine swallowing nameless Africans. It was a marketplace with both sides bargaining in the shadows. For every foreign ship anchored off Ouida's coast, there were African intermediaries, kings, chiefs, soldiers, who helped fill its hulls. That truth is uncomfortable, but denial is even more dangerous. And yet, that is exactly what makes this new era of citizenship so powerful. It is not built on amnesia, but on acknowledgement. The diaspora isn't asking for a spotless history, it's asking for honesty. What happened centuries ago cannot be undone, but it can be understood, named, and owned. Without that, every passport handed to a descendant of the enslaved risks becoming another shallow gesture, a way to feel good without getting clean. Benin's willingness to face this truth makes it different. Unlike other nations that bury their shame beneath flags, Benin is using its guilt as currency for reconciliation. The new citizenship law wasn't drafted in the spirit of denial, it was written in the spirit of confession. It says, in essence, we were part of your loss, but now we choose to be part of your return. That kind of courage is rare in politics, rarer still in history. Still, not everyone in Africa is ready for this honesty. Some fear that acknowledging complicity gives the West more ammunition to shame the continent. But that fear misunderstands power. True strength doesn't come from hiding history, it comes from owning it. For centuries, Europe's power lay in its control of the narrative. By rewriting it, Africa takes back the script, and by confronting the ghosts of the past, it denies the West the privilege of defining Africa's moral identity. This is what makes the right of return movement different from other global repatriation efforts. It's not driven by guilt or money, it's driven by truth. It dares to say, yes, we traded lives once, but now we're trading that shame for solidarity. We're using what broke us to rebuild us. But this honesty also raises deeper questions, not just about Africa's past, but about the diaspora's future. How do you rebuild trust between a homeland that once betrayed you and descendants who no longer speak its tongue? How do you turn 4 centuries of suspicion into a bridge instead of a wound? That's the next test. Because opening a door is easy, rebuilding faith is not. And the diaspora's faith, once broken, isn't healed by sentiment. It's healed by structure, by laws, by the tangible promise that this time, Africa isn't just saying welcome back, it's proving it. Which leads us to the next battle. Can a piece of legislation truly rebuild 400 years of fractured identity? Can law become the language of love? That's what Benin is betting on, and it's where this story now turns. Here's a quick reminder. Please like, share, and subscribe to Black Culture Unlocked for powerful Black news, real stories of our heroes and leaders, and the rich culture and history the world tried to forget. The diaspora citizenship law wasn't written in the poetry of apology. It was crafted in the precision of power. For the first time, the homeland didn't just feel for its lost children. It built a legal bridge to bring them home. The framework is revolutionary in its simplicity. Benin's parliament designed a citizenship process that recognizes ancestry as legitimacy. If you can trace your lineage through genetic testing, family archives, or verified oral history, you can claim full citizenship, not honorary status, not a visa of pity. That means the same rights, the same passport, the same dignity as anyone born on Beninese soil. It's a small law on paper, but a colossal shift in philosophy. It says identity is not defined by geography, but by belonging. This law didn't emerge from thin air. It followed years of internal debate among Benin's intellectuals, historians, and legislators, a debate about what kind of future Africa should build. Should the continent remain a geography of borders drawn by colonizers, or should it become a spiritual homeland that reclaims all its descendants, wherever they were scattered? The law's answer was radical. Both. It kept the modern state intact, but rewired its soul. And perhaps that's what frightens the West most. A legal model where Africa doesn't just forgive, but organizes. For centuries, European powers built the world on the foundation of exclusion. Citizenship was used as a weapon to divide who belonged, who didn't, who was native, who was foreign. But Benin's law flips that logic. It transforms citizenship from a gate into a return. It takes a colonial instrument of separation and turns it into an ancestral reunion. Yet beneath the legal brilliance lies something deeply human. The diaspora doesn't just want a passport. It wants recognition. For generations, they've been told they were African in spirit, but foreign in paperwork. This law collapses that duality. It tells them, you don't have to choose. You can be American by circumstance, Caribbean by survival, and African by right. That combination terrifies systems built on keeping Black identity fragmented. Of course, with every bold idea comes bureaucracy. DNA kits, genealogical proofs, embassy queues. These are the new hurdles between longing and belonging. But even those obstacles carry meaning, because every time a descendant sits down to trace a bloodline, every time an official stamps an application, another piece of the broken circle is repaired. Bureaucracy, for once, becomes sacred, the paperwork of resurrection. And yet, even as this law promises unity, it exposes another rift. Who gets to define proof? What happens when technology, profit, and politics start dictating ancestry? What happens when identity itself becomes an algorithm? The law may have given diaspora citizenship a legal face, but in the 21st century, proof wears a digital mask. The descendants of the enslaved now find themselves submitting not to kings or priests, but to laboratories. In Benin and beyond, identity has become something you upload, scan, or send in a vial. The new gatekeepers of ancestry don't stand at the ports of Ouida anymore. They sit behind DNA databases in California. The question is no longer, where do you come from? But what does your genome say? This is where the new right of return collides with the old systems of control. Companies, owned and managed largely outside Africa, now mediate the spiritual relationship between Black people and their origins. Africans abroad spit into tubes, pay corporate fees, and wait for emails telling them they are 17% Yoruba, 22% Mende, or 31% Ewe. It's marketed as revelation, but it's also extraction, data extraction. Millions of African descendants are feeding their DNA to databases that could one day be used for research, marketing, or surveillance. For Africa, this is a double-edged sword. On one side, DNA testing helps bridge the gap between lost families and forgotten homelands. It gives people something tangible after centuries of destruction. On the other hand, it risks turning belonging into a commodity, a genetic subscription you have to buy. The diaspora ends up paying to prove what colonization erased. The very technology meant to heal can easily become a new form of ownership. Benin's officials know this tension well. When drafting the diaspora citizenship law, they debated whether DNA should be mandatory proof or optional evidence. The final decision kept it flexible. Ancestry could also be proven through oral testimony or historical record. That was not bureaucratic leniency, it was a philosophical stance. It was a rejection of the idea that Africa needs a machine to tell it who its children are. Still, the world moves toward data, not memory. Silicon Valley has become the new archive of African lineage, and that reality carries danger. The same systems that track ancestry also track behavior. A person's search for heritage could become a file, a statistic, or worse, a tool for manipulation. This isn't paranoia, it's a pattern. Every empire, digital or physical, eventually learns that information is the most profitable form of control. But there's another layer to this. For centuries, Africans were reduced to flesh, bodies, and labor. Now, in a strange inversion, they are reduced to code. Blood that once built the world's wealth now builds genetic databases. It's a quiet continuation of extraction, except this time it's consented to because it comes wrapped in science and sentiment. So the question becomes, can Africa reclaim not just its people, but their data? Can it create its own repositories of ancestry, its own genetic archives, governed by African ethics rather than Western algorithms? In 2025, Benin's government announced plans to build its own National Genealogy and Heritage Archive, a sovereign database meant to preserve African DNA data and genealogical records under local jurisdiction. The idea is simple but revolutionary. If Africans and their descendants are going to trace their roots, the map should belong to Africa. That's not just tech policy, it's self-defense, because whoever owns your data owns your story. Western corporations have turned genetic information into a gold rush, using it to create ancestry products, pharmaceutical patents, and even algorithms that predict disease based on ethnicity. That means Africa's past is literally being mined for future profit. So when Benin says it will store diaspora genetic information on African soil, it's not a technical choice. It's a declaration of sovereignty. This digital reclamation has also inspired a new generation of African technologists. Young coders in Lagos, Nairobi, and Cotonou are working on decentralized ancestry platforms using blockchain designed to protect user privacy and keep profits in Africa. They're calling it ancestral autonomy. Instead of giving your DNA to foreign corporations, you store it in encrypted African networks where it becomes part of a collective digital heritage, not a corporate asset. Still, the road ahead is complex. The West won't let go of its data empire easily. Tech giants already dominate the global digital infrastructure, servers, algorithms, and even the social platforms through which the diaspora connects with home. Africa may be regaining control of its narrative, but it's doing so inside a system still coded in English, regulated in Washington, and monetized in California. Yet history has shown that Africa always finds a way to turn the master's tools against the master. Just as enslaved Africans once hid their languages in gospel songs, Africa's digital pioneers are hiding resistance in algorithms. They're using the same systems built for exploitation to engineer liberation. The significance of this movement can't be overstated. For the first time, Africa isn't just fighting for land or resources, it's fighting for memory. To own your past in the digital era is to own your future. And that's precisely what terrifies the West. Because if Africa controls its data, its diaspora, and its story, then the world's old hierarchies collapse. But digital sovereignty alone isn't enough. A continent can reclaim its memory, but without economic power to sustain that freedom, it risks becoming another museum of ideals. Which leads to the next part, how Africa is transforming return into capital and ancestry into economic muscle. Benin's new law didn't just open the doors of belonging, it opened the floodgates of investment. The first wave of returnees isn't coming with empty hands. They're coming with capital, connections, and creative energy. The diaspora, scattered for centuries, has accumulated intellectual wealth across the world. from Silicon Valley engineers and Wall Street strategists to artists, entrepreneurs, and scientists. Now, the homeland is offering them a new proposition. Don't just trace your roots, build on them. The government of Benin has quietly launched the Diaspora Development Fund, a structure designed to channel remittances and investments from new citizens directly into infrastructure, energy, and education projects. The idea is audacious: turn ancestral guilt into economic growth. For every descendant who returns, there's an opportunity not just to reconnect with history, but to reshape the continent's future. A symbolic passport becomes a literal pipeline of progress. And it's working. Early reports suggest millions in diaspora funding are being redirected toward local projects in Benin's southern provinces, solar grids, agro-processing facilities, and digital schools. These aren't foreign aid packages, they're homegrown investments. They don't come with Western conditions attached, because this time, Africa is the one writing the terms. Across the continent, similar ripples are forming. Ghana's Beyond the Return initiative continues to draw entrepreneurs who see the continent not as a place of nostalgia, but as the next economic frontier. Rwanda is attracting African Americans and Caribbeans through its Reconnect Africa program. Sierra Leone and Senegal are experimenting with joint investment citizenship models. The message is clear: the era of begging for development is ending, and the era of building it together has begun. But this transformation comes with responsibility. When money moves, politics follows. Africa must ensure that diaspora inclusion doesn't become a new form of inequality, where returnees live in gated ancestral estates while locals remain excluded. True economic liberation means partnership, not hierarchy. It means turning the nostalgia of return into cooperative ownership, and that's where Benin's genius lies. Grounding citizenship in shared heritage, it has made return a collective act, not a private one. It ties emotion to enterprise, and enterprise to empowerment. This is the alchemy that the West didn't expect. Africa turning trauma into trade, sorrow into strategy. The more this model succeeds, the more it threatens the old financial order that once kept Africa dependent. Because if the diaspora invests directly, what happens to the middlemen, the IMF, the World Bank, the development consultants who profited from poverty? That's the question echoing in Western boardrooms right now, because what began as an emotional homecoming is quietly evolving into a financial rebellion, one where the children who were sold are now buying back the world, one investment at a time. And yet, money alone can't complete this revolution. Wealth can build skyscrapers, but it can't rebuild trust. For every plane that lands carrying a new citizen, there's someone on the ground watching, someone who never left. And that encounter between the returned and the remained is where the story becomes painfully human. Because while laws, data, and investments can be drafted into harmony, hearts take longer to catch up. The reunion isn't always a celebration. Sometimes it's an awkward silence between two branches of the same tree, trying to remember the sound of their shared roots. Local communities in Benin are proud, but cautious. To them, the returnees often appear draped in privilege, armed with Western passports, fluent in foreign currencies, and occasionally carrying a faint air of superiority. They arrive with visions of innovation, but also expectations shaped by another world. Meanwhile, locals carry the weight of everyday survival, electricity cuts, job scarcity, and the slow rhythm of bureaucracy. When these realities collide, romantic notions of return can quickly dissolve into misunderstanding. Yet, this tension is not hostility, it's the negotiation of belonging. The returnees come searching for home, and the residents are learning how to share it. The gap between them isn't cultural, it's historical. One side was taught to forget, the other was taught to endure. Both inherited the aftermath of a rupture they didn't cause, and now, standing face to face, they must learn to build something neither side fully remembers. The Beninese government has anticipated this friction. Through community integration programs tied to the citizenship law, returnees are encouraged not to isolate themselves in elite enclaves, but to live among locals, learn the language, and participate in civic life. This isn't charity, it's reciprocity. The message is clear: you can't reclaim a homeland from the outside. To belong here, you must contribute here. But rebuilding trust takes more than social programs. It requires humility. The diaspora often carries romanticized visions of Africa, an imagined paradise where ancestors whisper through the wind and redemption feels easy. The truth is grittier. Africa is alive, complex, and sometimes unforgiving. It doesn't conform to diaspora expectations of heritage tourism. It demands patience, respect, and work. And when returnees meet that reality, the spiritual journey becomes real. At the same time, locals are beginning to see the returnees differently, not as foreigners, but as lost relatives bringing back fragments of a forgotten world. The exchange is mutual. While the diaspora rediscovers its roots, the homeland rediscovers its reflection. The accents are different, but the rhythm is the same. In markets, schools, and ministries, something extraordinary is happening. Africans from two timelines are learning to speak to each other again. That human reconnection is the most revolutionary part of all. Because this movement was never just about citizenship, it was about healing the fracture that colonialism created. Every successful return challenges the myth that Africa's past and future are separate continents. And yet, beneath this unfolding reconciliation lies a more profound truth. To return physically is one thing. To return psychologically is another. The deeper revolution, the one that no passport can document, is what happens inside the mind. And that's where the next part of this story lives. For centuries, Africa's children were taught to question their worth, their beauty, their history. The chains that once clinked on wrists didn't vanish. They migrated inward into language, religion, and thought. To undo that damage, the diaspora's return must become more than physical. It must be psychological decolonization. When the descendants of the enslaved step back onto African ground, they don't just see geography, they see reflection. Every street name, every monument, every rhythm carries echoes of what they lost and what they never knew they still had. But this encounter does something deeper. It dismantles the inferiority complex that centuries of Western conditioning built. Suddenly, Africa isn't a backdrop of pity or poverty. It's an archive of genius, resilience, and beauty. That shift in perception is not just emotional, it's political warfare. Because once Black people begin to see Africa as the center, not the margin, the entire global hierarchy begins to shake. Benin's new citizens are living proof of that transformation. The ceremony that began with paperwork often ends in pilgrimage, visits to ancestral villages, language classes, music schools, and local temples. Returnees are rediscovering what was hidden from them, that Africa's history didn't begin with colonization, it began with civilization. From the Knox sculptures to the Mali empires, from Benin's bronze artistry to Ethiopia's ancient Christianity, they find a lineage that redefines their place in the world. And that rediscovery rewires something essential in the human spirit: dignity. This psychological return also ignites something powerful in those who never left. Locals, seeing their lost brothers and sisters reclaim the land, are reminded that the same forces that enslaved them once enslaved their confidence. Watching the diaspora fall in love with Africa again teaches Africans at home to see themselves differently. It's a mirror both ways, one side remembering its roots, the other remembering its worth. But this rebirth doesn't come without pain. Healing rarely does. To return mentally, one must confront uncomfortable truths: the religious alienation, the self-hate, the subtle admiration for Western validation that still lingers in African society. True independence isn't in flags or parliaments. It's in rejecting the lie that your existence requires external approval. The new diaspora movement is slowly proving that to love Africa is not nostalgia, it's rebellion. And perhaps that's the real Blaxit the West fears. Not the migration of bodies, but the migration of belief. Because when Africa's descendants no longer crave the Western gaze, when they stop measuring progress by Western applause, the empire loses its psychological grip. That's what this movement threatens. Not borders, but narratives. So yes, Ciara's return began with a passport, but it ends with a revolution of perception. A new generation is learning that Africa was never the exile. Exile was the distance between truth and self. And now, that distance is closing. The diaspora is not coming back as victims, but as visionaries, armed not with chains, but with memory. And that is how a people truly return. Not when they find the land again, but when the land finally finds them. If home finally calls your name after 400 years, would you have the courage to answer? Let us know in the comment section what you would do if the history you were taught was never yours to begin with. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it, because here we tell the stories no one else will. From ancient African civilizations to modern Black excellence, we reveal the truth, the power, and the legacy they tried to erase. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.